Well, thank you very much for that warm welcome. I was starting to wonder where the Violet Beauregard stuff was going. I quite enjoyed that. I don't have any kind of spectacular finale planned, like bursting into a blueberry and rolling away, but I will try my best to keep you interested for the next 30, 40 minutes or so. Ooh, where are my slides? Yes. Okay, so I'm going to start out with a quote that neatly encapsulates what I want to talk about today. So this is from a recent article in the Annual Review of Psychology. This article reviews work practices, the way work is organized, and the expectations for how work should be performed. And the authors concluded that today's workplace remains a relic of the past. So this lecture is going to ask the question, is the organizational culture in STEM higher education institutions a good fit for today's workforce? And I can tell you right now, my answer to that is no, but I will present to you the rest of the slides and see if you agree with me. Okay, because I'm a lecturer, I have to start off with definitions, okay? We'll start off by clarifying what we mean by organizational culture. So in the business and management literature, organizational culture refers to collectively held beliefs, assumptions, and values held by organizational members. These are shared beliefs, shared assumptions about the organization and the way it works. Kind of a way to summarize it all is this idea of who we are, how we act, what is right. So culture tends to arise from the values of organizational leaders, initially from the founders, over time, the people who lead the organization, and assumptions about the right way of doing things, the right way of doing work, which are learned over time. Culture, according to the research, there's a lot of research on this in the organizational behavior literature, having a strong culture can be in many ways beneficial for organizations. It can differentiate them from their competitors. It can give the members of the organization a really strong sense of identity and belonging. And it can provide staff with sort of a blueprint for behavior, what to do when challenges arise in the workplace. But strong cultures can also lock organizations into counterproductive habits. It can kind of freeze organizations and sort of constrain their behavior and their responses to changes in the environment. It can constrain people's ideas of what is possible, their strategies of action. So when people encounter a problem in the workplace, the organizational culture provides a set of behavioral responses, and in the case of a very strong organizational culture, that set of responses can be limited. So what does organizational culture look like in academia more broadly, and in STEM disciplines in particular? What the research on this tells us, and the research comes from all sorts of different places, it's amazing how similar it all is. It doesn't really matter what continent you're looking at, doesn't matter what country you're looking at, it all basically tells us the same thing. In organizations such as your own, I don't know if this will sound familiar to you or not, but what the research tells us is that putting in long working hours is often seen as necessary to be perceived by others as a high achiever. This long hours culture tends to be reinforced by having group activities like meetings, like research seminars, taking place outside of core working hours, sometimes on weekends. Conferences, for instance. Flexibility in these types of cultures tends to be limited to the timing and location of long hours of work. So you're flexible in terms of when you want to put in your long hours, and you're flexible in terms of where you want to perform them, but then the hours themselves are not that flexible. There tend to be few opportunities available for part-time work, for job sharing. People who do avail themselves of flexible work practices like these often report feeling marginalized, being perceived as not pulling their weight, not ambitious, not in line for a promotion for career advancement. There's a lot of qualitative and quantitative studies in the business and management literature consistently reporting that academics and other professionals with flexible work arrangements are viewed as quote-unquote time deviants. Research has found that professionals who take career breaks or who use flexible work practices can experience slower wage growth, earn fewer promotions, and have lower performance reviews in some instances. And they're often perceived as less motivated, less dedicated to work, less ambitious, less committed than those who conform to norms for full-time work hours, continuous career paths that start right after you finish your education and you keep going until you retire. So this is known as the flexibility stigma, and there's a growing amount of research looking at this flexibility stigma. It's particularly pronounced for men. So women do suffer from the flexibility stigma, not to as great an extent often as men do, counterintuitively. Men have traditionally been assumed to prioritize work over family. Therefore, the stigma that arises when they do something overtly counter to that tends to be stronger for them than it is for women. There's been research among male professionals showing that they experience conflict between work and family, often to the same extent as their female colleagues do. But they cope with it differently. So they take time off work for family reasons, but they don't do so in a sort of overt, straightforward manner. They pretend they're meeting with clients. They pretend they're doing something work-related that is off-site in order to avoid the sort of negative being stigmatized for looking after family commitments instead of prioritizing work. Career structures and funding arrangements in academic departments often do not easily accommodate career breaks, like taking parental leave, like taking maternity leave. Career breaks tend to temporarily slow down publication rates, so this can affect performance reviews, this can affect career advancement, this can affect grant applications. If the career break takes place during a grant period, what we're hearing, the evidence is that sometimes people think this negatively, it can negatively affect the annual performance of the grant. This can lead to subsequent problems in obtaining grants in future. And finally, STEM and academia is seen as a highly competitive environment, particularly early on in careers when grant funding and a steady and high rate of publication is expected in order to advance. So the definitions of performance and of good performance are often very narrowly focused on specific research-related activities, and these definitions tend to underemphasize other activities that take place in universities, such as student-oriented roles, like teaching, like pastoral care, and community-oriented roles, like departmental administration or outreach work. In their contribution to the House of Commons Science and Technology Select Committee Inquiry into Women in STEM Careers, the Society of Biology reported that academia was a male-orientated network with traditional male working patterns and a macho culture. So this type of culture, which is not unique to STEM organizations, but is particularly pronounced, this type of culture is based on the notion of an ideal worker. So the ideal worker has no responsibilities beyond paid employment and can therefore be available continuously and full-time for work activities. The ideal worker has someone at home who is looking after anything that doesn't have to do with work. So this was a reasonably effective model back when single career or single earner families were the norm. So breadwinners could devote the majority of their time, their energy to paid work because they had partners who were responsible for domestic work, who were responsible for childcare. But how normal is this norm now? Demographic shifts over the last few decades have rendered this model unworkable for most people. For a few privileged families, this can still be the model. But dual earner families are now the most common type of couple household in the UK. Only 1 in 10 mothers of dependent children doesn't work outside the home. There are fewer families now who can afford to have one person who is economically inactive to stay at home and look after the household. So most workers will be responsible, therefore, not just for their paid work, but for all the unpaid work that family life involves. And this includes childcare and household work, but it includes increasingly elder care. With an aging population across the UK and across Europe, more workers than ever are being called upon to provide informal, unpaid care for older or disabled relatives. So half the adults in the UK who provide this kind of informal care are also employed, either part-time or full-time. And some of the care provided is quite significant in terms of the time commitment. So 29% of informal caregivers are putting in 35 hours a week or more on unpaid elder care. And as the population continues to get older, this is going to be more and more of us being called upon to do this sort of work. So, what are the staffing implications of this type of organizational culture? What this kind of a culture does is it acts as a barrier to the full participation of individuals who have responsibilities outside of work. So this is mostly women who continue to perform the majority of unpaid care for both adults, dependents, and for children. But increasingly, men are also being disadvantaged by this type of organizational culture. Men are participating in family life to a greater extent than ever before, especially younger men. There's a definite upward trend visible in the research, and there's an increasing amount of research on fatherhood, changing ideals of fatherhood. We are seeing a generational shift in the ideals that are associated with fatherhood. So what used to be quite common was this idea of what was called set-piece fatherhood. You were a good father if you showed up to your child's school play, if you showed up to their football tournament, if you showed up to their birthday party. Now, it's moved towards this picture of involved fatherhood. You are a good father if you pick up your child from school, if you supervise their homework, if you cook them dinner, if you put them to bed, if you do that hands-on daily care. So these new generations of men are much less likely than their predecessors to have partners at home to whom they can delegate all that tedious daily stuff, like looking after homework, like looking after picking up people from school, like cooking dinner. They can't delegate all their personal commitments and household responsibilities because there's no one at home full-time to do these things. So national level policies like shared parental leave are trying to address this generational change by acknowledging that these caregiving responsibilities need to be equalized before there's going to be really a level playing field in the workplace. If you have half your workforce who is doing all this extra unpaid work at home, that's not putting people on an equal playing field in the workplace. If more men start to take shared parental leave, once everybody is equally burdened with unpaid domestic work, then equality is within our grasp. And we're not there yet, but that's the kind of, that's the driver of these types of policies. We can see the impact of this kind of culture when we look at the statistics for women's representation in STEM occupations. So in 2017, women made up 23% of those in core STEM occupations in the UK. In the science professionals category, they were 42% of the total. Used to be 50% back in 2015, so that's been dropping. The proportion of SET managers who are women is now 15%. And this underrepresentation can also be seen in academia to an even greater extent. So in the academic year 2015-16, only 14% of professors across Imperial College were women, for instance. And this is not a pipeline issue in terms of having too few women available at lower levels to draw from. Across the UK, in the academic year 2016-17, so last year, women comprised 57.5% of all students, undergraduate and postgraduate, registering for medicine and dentistry courses. Women made up 79% of all those enrolled in subjects allied to medicine. There's been a continued rise in the percentage of female students studying science subjects overall, up to 42% last academic year. But we are not seeing a corresponding rise in the numbers of women progressing to senior levels in academia. So plenty of women at the lower levels of the pipeline, they're not there at the end. So for example, in the UK in 2014-15, 66% of bioscience postgraduate students were female, only 18% of the professors were. Something's happening. You can see the same pattern evident here in the Department of Medicine. The further up the hierarchy you go, the fewer women you see. So this is a leaky pipeline issue. The supply is good. The women are there to begin with, but they're being lost on the way up the career ladder. Academia has real problems recruiting and retaining women in STEM subjects. And increasingly, they're going to have problems recruiting and retaining younger men to work in these areas as well. So in terms of the performance implications of this type of culture, STEM culture, there are a number that I'd like to talk through briefly. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the depleted talent pool, the lost performance benefits of gender balance, how this deflects attention away from rational metrics of production. It enables subscribing to this myth of meritocracy, and it helps facilitate the cult of the top performer. So first of all, kind of the most basic issue, the underrepresentation of women means that universities are drawing from a smaller talent pool. Okay? So if we assume that the number of highly talented individuals is the same, the proportion is the same amongst both men and women, we have no credible evidence to suggest otherwise. An underrepresentation of one gender in the workplace implies that institutions are missing out on top talent, that they're having to dip into those kind of mediocre levels in order to make up their staffing. This is not useful. It also means that institutions are missing out on the performance benefits that are attributed to gender-balanced workforces and leadership teams. We have a lot of research from the private sector looking at gender composition and performance across a range of sectors and industries, including research and development and including knowledge work. So we don't have very much from specific academic contexts, but we have enough from private sector organizations where individuals are similarly educated, doing similar types of knowledge work, that we can extrapolate the results. The presence of women in leadership positions has been found to improve organizational performance in economic terms. Greater gender balance in leadership teams is associated with greater profitability for private sector firms, as well as greater innovation in research and development context. Mixed gender leadership teams have consistently been found to outperform all male teams. We don't know what all female leadership teams can do because there are too few of them to actually run any studies. Hopefully in the future we'll start to get a little bit, the idea is that you need diversity and that all female teams are not going to be any better than all male teams, but who knows? We can't study this yet. Organizations that have a higher proportion of women on their senior leadership teams, though, so not just like one or two token women, but enough to actually make a difference, perform significantly better than firms with the lowest proportion. There's even research on hedge funds headed by women versus men, and the ones headed by women tend to outperform the ones headed by men. So these positive results may happen because having more women on your leadership teams or in your workforce overall increase an organization's skill diversity, right? So research on gender diversity in teams shows that teams that have more diversity are likely to have a broader range of task-relevant knowledge, skills, and abilities, members with different opinions, different viewpoints, different experiences, different perspectives. So this gives your diverse team a larger pool of resources from which to draw when doing their work. It broadens team members' perspectives. It can encourage more creative, more innovative performance. And this can also prevent teams from coming to a consensus too early on issues that need careful consideration. So what the studies tell us consistently is that team members who are exposed to views that are different from their own, perspectives that are different from their own, will exert more cognitive effort, attend to more aspects of a situation or a challenge, and are more likely to come to new decisions or identify new innovative solutions. So this is of crucial importance for workers who are engaged in knowledge work, right? Tasks are complex. The solutions, it's not like there's one right answer to anything. You can't make decisions quickly. You need to think about things. So having that diversity leads to better cognitive processes, better decision making. The positive impact of female leaders on organizational performance might also be attributable to just having a wider mix of leadership styles in operation. So research finds that women are more likely to engage in leadership behaviors that are typically rated by subordinates as being more effective. Okay. So participative leadership tends to be performed by more women than men. This involves consultation with subordinates, more democratic processes of decision-making. Also, women are more likely to engage in what's called transformational leadership than men are. So transformational leadership, it always sounds a bit woo-woo when you read about it, but it involves things like trying to intellectually stimulate your subordinates, demonstrating consideration, individualized consideration for subordinates, efforts to inspire them, try to empower them to take responsibility for meeting the organization's goals themselves. Male leaders are more likely than female leaders to use directive leadership, where you tell people what to do and then wait for them to do it, and also transactional leadership. So that's a style that is based on what they call contingent reward. It basically means, you will get this if you do that, and if you don't do this, you won't get this, or I'll give you something else that you won't like. It's a very much an exchange thing. And I'm not trying to say that, men always do these ineffective leadership styles and women always do the great ones, because that is not the case, but women are more likely to engage in these styles that have become more fashionable recently, more popular recently. So having a broader repertoire of leadership styles to draw upon does give organizations better opportunities to find behaviors that are going to be appropriate to the particular context, if any specific performance issue. Another important implication of this type of organizational culture that's found in academia and STEM disciplines is that conforming to cultural norms for being a good worker can become more important than assessing whether or not these work practices are actually effective. So there's an increasing amount of research on professionals and what is called the work devotion schema. Okay, so this is sort of a mental model that says high-level professionals should demonstrate their commitment to their profession by making work a really central focus of their lives. So Epstein et al. Did some interesting research with corporate lawyers, finding that they talked about overwork as a kind of a heroic activity. This is the language that they used to describe it. It was a way of measuring masculinity for the male leaders of the law firm. Cooper did an interesting study of tech companies, and the engineers talked about kind of a machismo culture. They said, the people who conspicuously overwork are often guys, and I think it's usually for the benefit of other guys, is what they were saying. A real man works 90-hour weeks, you work 50-hour weeks, you're kind of a slacker. There was a really interesting study by Kellogg that looked at a compulsory reduction in work hours amongst surgeons. Okay. So it basically found, and when I read about this, I was like, God, going down from 120 hours a week to 80 hours a week? Like, 80 hours is still too much, but okay, that's good. No, it was not good. These surgeons did not like that. So what Kellogg found was that there was a very strongly kind of masculine culture in place in this hospital amongst these surgical residents, and it could resist even mandated changes to work practices, okay? So the new rule that was introduced said that surgical residents could work no more than 80 hours a week, in contrast to the traditional 120-hour work weeks. Virtually all of the senior doctors opposed this rule, okay? These older surgeons had built their identities around this idea of being what they called an Iron Man, too strong to need sleep like an ordinary person, okay? If you practically lived at the hospital, that was like a badge of honor. That meant you were a good surgeon, you were dedicated, you were committed to your job. They called surgeons who wanted to comply with the new time rule all sorts of interesting names, which also tells you what they think about women. Weak, softies, part-timers, wusses, panty waists, that's my favorite, and girls. That's the worst insult you could possibly give somebody, right? So this is culturally specific, and it's also related to class. So there's been research done in different countries showing that in Anglo-Saxon countries, having a strong work ethic is sort of read as a guarantee of kind of moral standards. We're kind of equating working hard with being a good person. Okay? Hard work and competence are equated with moral superiority, especially if they result in professional success. Research amongst professionals in France does not find the same kind of attitudes. Okay? Work ethic is not seen as being a central component of a moral character. And ambition, wanting to get ahead, wanting to reach the top of your organization, it's seen as a sign of character by male professionals in Anglo-Saxon cultures, but not by blue-collar or working-class men, who are more likely to see ambition as a kind of a narcissism. So these things are very specific. It's not like all men feel a certain way about work, or all surgeons feel a certain kind of way about work, or all workers do. They are very specific. So this work devotion schema connects moral superiority with elite status. It's a way of kind of signaling your elite status. So 50 years ago, for instance, maybe 60, elite status was conveyed by displaying how much leisure time you had, right? Like, I'm a banker, I work from 9 to 3. Look at me, I'm just gonna sit around now and read my book. Now, professionals use long work hours to convey how important they are, how hard they work, what good people they are, right? I'm so virtuous, I'm so busy, I work such long hours. So this long hours kind of masculine culture kind of gives you moral credentials in a way. Now, social norms and identities, they incentivize behavior for individuals. It can become difficult in some cases in organizations then to differentiate between identity performance and actual productivity. Okay, so you're busy, you're here a long time, you're talking about how much work you're doing or how long you're working. Is this the most efficient, effective way of getting work done? So, for example, the presumption in academia, at least in my experience of it and in much of the research, is that the ideal professor is someone who is always on. You may not want to answer your students on a Sunday, but you've seen their email, you're just waiting until Monday to answer it, right? You work ridiculous hours sometimes. You travel extensively. Research is really the only thing that matters. So by this metric, women tend to be at a disadvantage compared to men because they generally shoulder more of the unpaid caregiving duties outside of work. They are therefore assumed to be less productive. And this is rarely challenged explicitly. But it's a really interesting study done, published last year. Research on 10,000 economists showing that as measured by quantity and quality of publications, looking at the impact factor of the journals that they were publishing in, women with children economists, women with children, outperform child-free workers at nearly every stage over the lifespan of a 30-year career, except when their children are very young. So a mother of 3 children on average, according to their findings, has on average a research record reflecting a loss of 4 years of research output by the time all of her children have reached their teens. A mother with 2 children loses about 2.5 years of productivity. The productivity penalty not as severe for fathers as it is for mothers. So on average, approximately 5.4% for fathers versus 19.1% for mothers. But women are making up for that lost productivity over the course of the rest of their careers. And academic careers do tend to be a long game. We stick around, we're here a long time. So taking an evidence-based approach, it doesn't really make sense to think in terms of short-term games, how much did you publish in the last 5 years? I don't know if you have the same forums for promotion that I do, but they're always like, in the next 5 years, what are you going to do? What did you do in the last 5 years? I'm planning to be here for 20 or 30 years. Let's look at the longer term. So this idea that women who have children are necessarily less research productive turns out not necessarily to be the case. Strong organizational cultures like those found in academia can also camouflage the effectiveness of organizational processes. So academic workplaces often pride themselves on being meritocratic, okay? We have a system that rewards merit with success. People are rewarded for their intelligence and their skills. And on paper, meritocracy is great for equality, right? If an organization evaluates people on their performance, on their skills, their abilities, their merit, without consideration of their gender, their ethnicity, their caregiving status, anything, and leaders are objective in their assessments, then equality would naturally follow. In practice, merit-based outcome allocations are often performed in a manner that tends to reinforce the status quo and favors dominant groups, because those are the ones who tend to control the evaluation processes, and they control the definition of merit. And that tends to most closely match what they themselves do, right? Because if I'm doing something, it has to be good. This is how I feel anyway. There's an increasing amount of research evidence showing that the premise of meritocracy is flawed. So for example, Castilla and Bernard did a whole series of really interesting studies, and all of these studies found that when an organization's core values emphasized meritocratic values, managers would award larger monetary rewards to male employees and to female employees who were performing at the same level, who had identical performance reviews. So they call this the paradox of meritocracy. And this paradox of meritocracy builds on other research showing that when people think that they are being objective and unbiased, then they don't monitor their own behavior. They don't scrutinize their own decisions. They just assume that they're right and that their assessments are accurate. And this is why meritocracy can actually exacerbate inequality, because being committed to meritocratic principles makes people think that they actually are making correct evaluations and behaving fairly. Organizations that emphasize meritocratic ideals reinforce an individual's belief that he or she is fair and impartial. So this creates the exact conditions under which implicit and explicit biases get unleashed. When people believe that outcomes ought to go only to those who are most deserving, it becomes very easy to fall into the trap of believing that outcomes currently do go only to those who are most deserving. So people will believe that men deserve to be overrepresented at senior levels and that women deserve not to be. An interesting example of this, research by Jenny Hubler. She was looking at women's perceptions of their own family-to-work conflict, and then those women's managers and their perceptions of the women's family-to-work conflict. One of the things she found is that there was not a lot of correlation between what women thought they were facing, what their managers thought they were facing. The managers were all men in this instance. Another interesting thing she found was that the managers' perceptions, assumptions about the level of family-to-work conflict that their female subordinates were facing, these affected their perceptions of women's promotability, of their performance, and it actually held women back from promotions, even when these perceptions were inaccurate. There were assumptions made about the level of family demands, and those assumptions made managers think this person is not going to be promotable until her children are much older, and in reality, there were no such performance issues taking place. Social psychology has a lot of research documenting what's called the similar to me bias. It's a bit of a boring name, but at least it tells you exactly what it's about. This is where leaders tend to set up systems that reward and promote individuals like themselves. And this can lead to inadvertent discrimination towards women when leaders are predominantly male. Finally, one more thing that impacts performance in organizational cultures, like those found in STEM disciplines, is the creation of what's called the cult of the top performer. So what this cult of the top performer does is tolerate otherwise unacceptable behavior among individuals who have a very prolific publication and funding record. Okay? The management literature refers to these people as brilliant jerks. Like that's an actual management term. They're very productive in a very narrowly defined sense, but they don't play well with others. Okay? They don't share their success. They don't mentor junior colleagues in order to kind of raise up others and share their own skills. And having these individuals serve as role models in the organization for performance and for behavior can have unintended and negative side effects. And the most obvious ones are damaging morale. No one wants to work with these people. It's very demoralizing to see someone else behaving like a jerk when you are trying your best to be a decent person, and they're getting promoted and you're still at the bottom. It also discourages non-jerks from pursuing careers in academia or staying in the organization or seeking leadership positions. The cult of the top performer prioritizes very narrowly defined performance metrics over longer-term indicators that really do benefit the organization. Collaboration, service to the department or the institution, developing junior researchers. These are not things that brilliant jerks do. And sending the signal that these types of activities are not valued in an organization means that fewer people will engage in them over time, and that has a detrimental effect on long-term performance. So here's where we get to the part where we're like, okay, so can culture be changed? Yes, but my quick summary of the management literature on this is it's not quick and it's not easy, unless you fire everybody and start over again, but that's not something that's going to happen. Organizations are human systems with patterns, habits, and mindsets, that have been there for some time. They took quite a long time to establish themselves. They've evolved over time, and they're notoriously hard to shift. Williams et al. Talk about identity threat perspective as a key concept that explains why there is often resistance to culture change efforts in organizations. So they're explaining that people form core social identities on the job, what it means to be a good worker, what it means to be a good person. So people are invested in the status quo. They forge their identities around a specific way of doing things. So for instance, the example that Williams et al. Use is that if younger men in an organization are resisting or rejecting a long hours culture because they believe that a good father is involved in the daily care of his children, then what does that mean for the older men in the organization who saw themselves as breadwinners and subscribed to this work devotion schema? Are they bad fathers? Are they actually bad people? Have they been mistaken their whole lives? Have they been doing things the wrong way? Reshaping workplace norms can become personally threatening for individuals who have subscribed to these norms for a very long period of time. One way to address this is by what they call changing narratives, okay? The stories that people tell about themselves in organizations, the language they use. These are key elements of organizational culture. This is how culture gets transmitted and passed on. How do workers talk about themselves and the work that they do? So Kellogg's study of surgeons that I mentioned earlier, she examined how an organization can successfully change norms around work hours when the work itself, those work hours, were seen by the surgeons as kind of a contest, to them as a masculinity contest. And so what Kellogg found was that male surgeons who did want a better work-life balance aligned themselves publicly with the women in the organization, none of whom thought that continuing to work 120 hours a week was a great idea, to resist this dominant narrative of the longer hours you work, the higher status you are, and that's how you convey your status, by working long hours. So they articulated kind of this alternative vision of high status. So the traditional narrative of the surgeons used words like, or terms like, we're working machines. You don't eat, you don't sleep. It was a point of pride to be virtually living at the hospital. But the men and women who wanted to comply with the new working rules, only 80 hours a week, started changing that discourse. They tried to introduce new narratives. So they talked about surgeons who were well organized, efficient, who knew how to prioritize tasks, so they could wrap up within 80 hours and pass off to whoever's covering the night shift. They didn't have to show off how long they worked in order to demonstrate how important they were. So a way of changing the narratives there. The theory of planned behavior says that our attitudes predict how we behave. They predict our actions. But Fessinger's cognitive dissonance theory argues that it can actually work the other way around. If you can change someone's behavior, they'll gradually change their attitude in order to maintain cognitive consistency. It's psychologically uncomfortable for us to do things that don't match up with our attitudes. So changing workplace practices can gradually lead to changes in attitudes towards certain ideas. So for instance, UCL has extended paternity leave to 4 weeks, better than 2 weeks, not great, but still a longer time. So this helps to reduce the idea that young women are the only people who are dangerous to hire or dangerous to promote because they're going to take tons of time off for maternity leave, and that's going to be difficult for the organization. The more that leave is made available and men are encouraged to take it, the more likely it is that anyone might go off on leave. No particular gender of worker is going to be more or less risky than the other. At University of Manchester, women returning from maternity leave are offered a 6-month period free from teaching duties so they can focus on research, try to keep them up to speed. This could obviously also be offered to men returning from parental leave. LSE had, at least they did when I was there, they offered a term sabbatical to all people coming back from parental leave, so as to encourage men to also take shared parental leave and not just have this be a women's issue. Bristol University has a women's returner scheme that offers up to 6 months of protected research leave. It's more flexible. Returners can use that money to fund a researcher, and again, that can also be extended to men on parental leave. Another important element is trying to destigmatize the use of flexible work practices and the people who do it. So this involves interrogating existing norms around career structures. Is there a good reason why people who work part-time can't be promoted? Sometimes it happens in departments, sometimes it just doesn't happen at all. Why is that? Can their contribution not be evaluated pro rata? Sometimes all it takes is really thinking about why things are done a particular way instead of just accepting that this is the way things are done. I have nothing more to say about this except that there's actual whole books out there talking about don't tolerate brilliant jerks. Don't do it. Don't reward them. Don't promote them. Try not to hire them in the first place. Don't let them continue doing that for years. It's not worth it. Okay, a really important issue. I love this photo, so please appreciate this photo. Work allocation. So a really important issue is sort of addressing the work allocation programs, or introducing work allocation programs if they don't already exist. So make sure that these programs really try as best they can to allocate equal distribution of teaching and pastoral responsibilities, as well as other non-research-based commitments. All the research in higher education finds women predominantly do these roles more than men do, and these are not the roles that are valued to any great extent when promotion reviews come up. They're always on the promotion sheets, and if you don't have them, maybe that makes you look bad, but having them doesn't really help you out that much. Also make sure that staff have equal access to the resources needed to complete their tasks. So when people in senior level positions have administrative support from professional services staff, but junior level people don't, that artificially inflates the assessment of both productivity and efficiency of senior level staff, right? And it helps to perpetuate this myth of meritocracy. Well, look how much more they're getting done in less time. Obviously they're better, obviously they deserve to be up there. No, they have staff. They have people doing things for them that nobody else has. So here, for work and resource allocation, this is where the importance of transparency and accountability becomes clear. Because these two things reduce bias, because transparency provides the information that's needed to track inequity and to track inequality. And accountability puts people on notice that their decisions are going to be monitored, they're going to be evaluated. People can see what they're doing. And finally, addressing promotional systems, very important. So higher education institutions in general should be looking at and valuing a wider range of contributions from staff and taking into consideration candidates that have successfully managed to combine work responsibilities with non-work responsibilities. There's also scope here to interrogate commonly used metrics of productivity. There was a fascinating study published a couple of years ago by Cameron et al., and they compared the publishing patterns of men and women working in ecology. They were using H-index scores. So when you use the H-index scores, it looked as though the men were more research active because they had higher scores on average than the women did. They had better publication records, more impact. But the researchers found sexual dimorphism in self-citation. Basically, the male academics self-cited to a much greater degree than the female academics did. and this inflated, artificially, their H-index score, even though they had lower citations on average per paper than the female academics did. So self-citation resulted in up to 14 extra H-index points for the men. Self-citation resulted in only up to 5 extra H-index scores for the women. So women's lower H-index scores were then exacerbated by them having more career absences than men did. When the self-citations and non-research active years were taken out of the analyses, the gender differences in research performance disappeared. So you no longer saw any evidence that men were publishing at a greater rate in more prestigious journals than the women were. The researchers replicated this finding among academics who are publishing in the journals Nature and Science. So this suggests this is not a discipline-specific result. So it turns out that when you use H-index scores to assess research performance, what you're actually doing is rewarding confident behavior and traditional career paths that are continuous. You're not actually evaluating real research impact. So the author suggested using an H-index that excludes self-citations divided by research active years. So they defined that as having at least one publication in a year that was research active. So they called this the ME quality index, the MEQ index. And they said this is a fairer evaluation of research impact, and it doesn't disadvantage anyone, because self-citation does not actually indicate that you have broader influence on your field. It just indicates you've read your own work. And researchers should really only be judged on the research active periods in their careers. Okay, so my downer of a message at the end is that changing cultures takes time, takes effort, and it is hard to get everybody on board. There will always be people who do not think that culture is a problem, because there will always be people for whom the culture is not a problem for them personally. But the evidence says otherwise. Recruitment, retention, performance, they're all linked to having a workplace culture that works for the majority of workers, not just for the few people at the top. And as that old saying goes, nothing will change if nothing changes. And because I can't stop myself, I put together a little reading list for anyone who is interested in reading more about these things. So I limited myself to 6 articles. But for anyone who's not familiar with the social science literature, there are some really interesting things on meritocracy, on workplace norms, on metrics, you know, the fairness of research productivity metrics, and on gender equality in general. So please do let me know if you'd like a printout of these, and I can supply you with those. No, I haven't. I'm done.